we're going to continue, the doc is going to continue on, both the question of Leibniz, but really also from this standpoint that Ernie mentioned in the last article, Leibniz as seen by Lyndon LaRouche through the eyes of Riemann. And the key to this is through the eyes of Lyndon LaRouche. And really trying to go at, well, what is it, first of all, that allows Lynn to get what he gets out of Leibniz, and what is it that was in Leibniz? And Leibniz says, if you take the triads, which we've discussed, and they may come up again, Leibniz is the figure who not only is the transmission belt from the first triad explicitly to the later work at the end of the 19th century. And there's not a complete symmetry here, because when you get to the end of the 19th century, in many ways, it's not completed. And that goes to what was discussed on the report today, by the basement. I mean, you have Vernadsky, you have some of the work being done by Pasteur and Pierre Curie in particular on asymmetry, something about the role of life in the universe. But this is pretty much left. Certainly in the Western elements, by the 1920s and 30s, it's gone. You have some remnant of it with Vernadsky and some traditions that still exist. But even that, I mean, I don't know that there's a whole lot following up on what Gurvich did, Franz Popp and a few other people, but it's not really being followed through. So that, where in a certain sense, the triad of Cusa, Brunelleschi, Cusa, Kepler had a certain resolution, you could say, in particular in the work that Leibniz does with the calculus, with the physics, and so on and so forth. That doesn't happen. And we're sort of suspended. The person who really maintains that tradition in the West, that practice of science, is Einstein, against the Copenhagen interpretation, and really what is the hegemony of mathematics. This is some of what Lynn, I think, is getting at, as I understand it. It's not just mathematics. Leibniz did mathematics. Gauss did mathematics. Riemann did mathematics. But in all of their cases, it was secondary. It wasn't the standard of truth. Even in the case of Gauss and Riemann, the standard of truth was a human practice on the universe and the discovery of further elements of the universe that are able to be controlled or understood by human beings. In the 20th century, that's not the standard. And in this way, I would say something maybe, in a certain sense, the Hilbert, Klein crowd out of Göttingen at the end of the 19th century had a bigger impact in some ways than Russell, because they were Göttingen. They were the keepers of the Holy Grail. Remember, Riemann was Göttingen. This was the center of the work that was supposed to follow Riemann. And what did they do? They turned Riemann into Euclid. They demanded a standard of deductive proof, which is the issue, not what the axioms are. Even logical positivists admit the possibility that your axioms might turn out to be wrong, and you might need to come up with a new axiom. But how do you do that? That's mystery. You can't even talk about that. It's the unspeakable. It's something that you could be a bum on the street and burp it out, and maybe that's the new axiom. There's no intelligible creativity. Now, Leibniz does represent a universal mind. I could read you something. I'm going to read you a couple things and then get to Ernie. But this may be somewhat instructive in its own way. This is a woman who's, it's an interesting biography. It's not bad. It's got some interesting stuff in it. All these things, they're never going to be what you want, but they might have some useful material in it. So she talks about the Nachlass the archive of Leibniz, and then I'll read you a better quote anyway. What the heck? Real quick, I'll leave it. Here it is. Then, the standard bibliography of literature on Leibniz before 1980, and she's making the point that there's a certain imbalance here that was corrected later, but even in then, 806 items on metaphysics and ontology, 552 on mathematics, 430 on logic, 282 on epistemology, 220 on the physical sciences, 154 on ethics, political philosophy and law, 135, theology and philosophy of religion, 122, linguistics, 98, and you get the idea, okay? He was definitely a universal thinker, and her point is that this was actually not, there was an overemphasis on mathematics and science, that indeed he had a great deal on political, moral, theological, philosophical questions that people were unaware of at that time and have become aware of now. So this, when he talks about a universal characteristic, and Ernie's going to bring this up, I'll give you another example of this. Russell, now here's where you get also the evil of Russell. Russell was, for a good part of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, considered to have the authoritative philosophical biography or analysis of Leibniz. And actually he wrote this in the 1890s, before he did the foundations of the principles of arithmetic, before any of this. This was about the mid of the 1890s, when Russell was in his middle 20s. And what's his argument about Leibniz? And I say this was standard until, it probably still is standard among certain circles.
Is it a biography?
Yeah, a philosophical analysis or something. I think it's part of his thing on the history of Western philosophy. It's worth noting, Russell spent time in Göttingen as a young, in the 1890s. He knew Hilbert, he knew these characters. This wasn't a minor thing, okay? He was part of organizing this process, which was really an attack on what Gauss and Riemann represented as a continuation and so on and so forth. And remember, this was, politically, this was a highly British influenced area. So what was Russell's view? Russell's view was that there were two Leibnizes. There was the real Leibniz, who was a logician, a mathematician and a logician, and was trying to develop a logical language. And there was a little bit he could use on this in the universal characteristic, because he didn't understand the way Leibniz applied it across the board, not just in the area of logic and science. So he said that was the real Leibniz, and this was the Leibniz that Russell respected. The unreal Leibniz was the political Leibniz, the moral Leibniz, the metaphysical Leibniz, who was doing things to gain the favor of various oligarchical factions, various imperial figures, etc., etc. Of course, that's all there was in Europe. If you wanted to influence politics, you had to influence the court. That's all there was. Okay? There wasn't, anyway, so this was the view of Leibniz that was preeminent in the West. In fact, the same person says, no less a figure than Bertrand Russell, so he concluded that Leibniz had not one philosophy, but two: a bad public philosophy, or fantastic fairy tale, quote unquote, designed to please and divert his courtly patrons, and a good private philosophy centered around the nuggets of logic and mathematics, which Russell himself so much admired. In recent decades, anyway, so you get the idea. This isn't Leibniz, and that's part of the reason I just read you that list. This is not, Leibniz saw the universe from the standpoint of universal harmony. And I'll read you a couple things that might be a little surprising in this vein. Okay? I read you that thing on medicine last week. That, the health of a population cannot be in the hand of the markets. The markets are irrational. They don't respect the human individual, so you can't leave it to the markets. Think about it. You could have Leibniz giving a speech against Obamacare. It would, maybe we should enter that into the congressional record. At any rate, but to give you a sense of a real quote that represents Leibniz, but this is his, in a funny way, this is his, if you like, slogan or anthem for all thinking. All these things are connected and have to be directed to the same aim, which is the glory of God and the advancement of the public good by means of useful works and beautiful discoveries. That's Leibniz to the Duke Johann Friedrich of Hanover, according to Russell, just trying to kiss his butt, in 1678. Tranquility is the step on the path toward stupidity. One should always find something to do, to think, to plan, concerning ourselves for the community and for the individual, yet in such a way that we can rejoice if our wishes are fulfilled and not be saddened if they are not. So, this is the real Leibniz. In fact, his whole view of logic, science, comes from his philosophical or theological outlook, including the moral behavior of human beings, which to him is what confuses Russell is he views morality and politics as a universal principle. Therefore, for him, the idea of a universal characteristic, that's what it means. Even he does talk about a language which is more precise, but all to let you discover what we need to discover. Now, I think the other thing to raise here is to define, in a certain sense, his role in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What does it mean that this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness came from Leibniz? And this is one of the most important insistences, even though it's perhaps less prominent now than it has been. Lynn has always insisted on this point, that it was Leibniz who was the inspiration. So he has a short thing, which anybody can read, called Felicity, which of course is happiness. I'll just read a couple sections. Virtue is the habit of acting according to wisdom. It is necessary that practice accompany knowledge. Wisdom is the science of felicity and is what must be studied above all other things. Felicity, happiness, is a lasting state of pleasure. Thus, it is good to abandon or moderate pleasures which can be injurious by causing misfortunes or by blocking the attainment of better and more lasting pleasures. Pleasure is a knowledge or feeling of perfection, not only in ourselves, but also in others. For in this way, some further perfection is aroused in us. To love is to find pleasure in the perfection of another. So this is certainly not he's redefining the concept of pleasure. And I think quite intentionally as a polemic. Because, of course, what's the Lockean view, later, of course, the standard utilitarian view, what they call the most, the most good for the most or something like that. They mean pleasure. They mean what we normally think of as pleasure. Something that makes us feel good at the moment. As, of course, one of the big things in the market is you're not supposed to consider anything else. That's called government regulation. If you think of anything but what you want at the moment, you're confusing the market. You're interfering. So, justice is charity or a habit of loving conformed to wisdom. Thus, when one is inclined to justice, one tries to procure good for everybody, so far as one can, reasonably, but in proportion to the needs and merits of each. And even if one is obliged sometimes to punish evil persons, it is for the general good. Now it is necessary to explain the feeling or the knowledge of perfection. The confused perception of some perfection constitutes the pleasure of sense. But this pleasure can be productive of greater imperfections which are born of it, as a fruit with a good taste and a good odor can conceal a poison. This is why one must shun the pleasures of sense, as one shuns a stranger, or sooner, a flattering enemy. Knowledge is of two kinds, that of facts and that of reasons. That of facts is perception, that of reason is intelligence. So these are quite concise statements of things. You've heard Lynn make the point about there are no facts. Knowledge of reasons perfects us because it teaches us universal and eternal truths, which are manifested in the perfect being. But knowledge of facts is like that of the streets of a town, which serves us while we stay there, but after leaving, which we don't wish to burden our memory any longer. The pleasures of the sense, I'm not going to go. The pleasures of sense, which most closely approach pleasures of the mind, and are the most pure and the most certain, are that of music and that of symmetry. The former being pleasure of the ears, the latter of the eyes. For it is to understand the principles of harmony, this perfection which gives us pleasure. The sole thing to be feared in this respect is to use it too often. But one cannot love God without knowing his perfections or his beauty. And since we can know him only in his emanations, these are two means of seeing his beauty, namely in the knowledge of eternal truths, which explain their own reasons in themselves, and in the knowledge of the harmony of the universe, and applying reason to facts. That is to say, one must know the marvels of reason and the marvels of nature. The marvels of reason and of eternal truths, which our mind discovers, in itself are essential in the sciences of reasoning about numbers, about figures, about good and evil, about justice and injustice, and so on. I haven't read it. It's basically just 2 pages of these kinds of senses, and how you can come up with anything like either Bertrand Russell, or what you get, of course, is that he's a rationalist. He believes in sort of strange metaphysical things, and so on and so forth. This is the Leibniz. This gives you at least itself a little taste of why Lynn focuses on the question of Leibniz as a critical historic figure. But otherwise,
All right.
we'll go to Ernie here.
Yeah.
Should I
Come pass these around.
Ernie?
You. So if there's you may
Ernie?
have to end up.
Ernie, you have to come over, you have to move your chair.
Yeah, okay.
The camera rules, Ernie.
All right.
It's not gonna be enough.
So,
Share.
It's 25, I think.
So after a lot of, reflection and reading a whole lot of stuff the last week, I decided this is the best. This is actually the best way. It's Lynn's discovery. It's sort of like Moses and the prophets, for our organization. But Lynn's discovery. I mean, he actually has made a really extraordinary discovery, and he's developed a whole new theory of knowledge. What actually is knowledge? With all the implications that his discovery has actually had, and I think we should just start reading through it and stop as we go along. And then I have when we get to the 3rd page, you'll see he takes up first. He's talking about paradoxes, which ordinarily would keep people from making this discovery that he made. He said they're like the dragons that guard the treasures, the secrets, and he was able to surmount it. And so and you'll see he'll get into what's called the clockwinder paradox, which is in the Leibniz-Clark debate, and then we'll take a look at that. But we'll stop along the way, the questions that come up. But I think we should just just start reading through this. So somebody wants to start, we can do it.
A central feature of my original contribution to the Leibniz science of physical economy is the provision of a method for addressing the causal relationship between, on the one side, individuals' contributions to axiomatically revolutionary advances in scientific and analogous forms of knowledge. Louder?
It's being recorded.
Sorry. And on the other side, consequent increases in the potential population density of corresponding societies. In its application to political economy, my method focused analysis upon the central role of the following three-step sequence. First, axiomatically revolutionary forms of scientific and analogous discovery. Second, consequent advances in machine tool and analogous principles. Finally, consequent advances in the productive powers of labor. These discoveries were initially the outgrowth of 1948-1952 objections to the inappropriateness of Norbert Wiener's application of statistical information theory to describing both the characteristic distinctions of living processes and of communication of ideas. Does anybody have that first footnote?
He's asking about the footnote.
No,
You-
the
you
footnote's
have-
on.
Okay.
You have at the back of this.
Yeah, okay.
Okay,
Yes.
I counted, do you have it?
Yeah, I have it, yeah. This is Norbert Wiener cybernetics
Oh,
for
yeah.
control and communication in the animal and the machine. Okay.
I countered with a contrary non-statistical definition of negentropy, as that meaning of the term might be derived from the common physically distinguishing characteristic of an evolutionary biosphere. This non-statistical counter-definition of negentropy was then stated in terms of a successfully self-developing physical economy. The efficient impact of scientific discoveries, communication within such a negentropic physical economic process was treated as most typical of the communication of ideas in general. That was the initial core of my discovery up to the year 1952. Yet up to that point, the appropriate mathematical representation of such a form of physical economic negentropy was still wanted. The third step, taken through an intensive 1952 study of Gare Contour's 1897 by Traga. Is that right? It's the second.
By Traga, yeah.
By Traga.
Uh-huh.
Do you have, there's a footnote there.
He just gives the reference. He doesn't, there's no
okay.
comment.
Open the doors of the transfinite domain upon a fresh insight into relevant features of Bernard Riemann's contributions. Thence the...
Footnote 3.
Just another, again,
All
references.
right. The
Okay.
applied form of my definition of physical economic negentropy acquired the title of the LaRouche-Riemann method.
Here he actually says something. From the late 1979 to the close of 1983, EIR produced a quarterly economic forecast based upon the LaRouche-Riemann method. This report was constructed quarterly from primarily a GNP-defined database, using a set of constraints supplied by this author. During this period, that was the only consistently reliable published forecast available from any U.S. source. The forecasting was discontinued during early 1988 at this author's recommendation. The margin of fakery in U.S. government and Federal Reserve System data rendered any report using such data worthless. And then he says, see Riemannian analysis predicts industrial top shutdown, EIR, and that's 1979. That was probably when Volcker, with the Volcker interest rate, we actually predicted the effect that would have. I remember that, the effect on the economy, and everybody else said it would be minimal, and we said that that was going to be devastating to the economy at that time. Yeah.
Number 1, neg entropy in physical economy. Initially, during 1948 through 1952, I made 2 principal arguments against Norbert Wiener's application of statistical method to living processes. The first of these 2 was that insofar as we employ the term negative entropy to signify the characteristic distinction of living processes in general, the phenomenon referenced cannot be described either in terms of a simple time reversal of thermodynamical statistical entropy, or in terms of the term energy used as a notion reducible to a scalar measure of heat. The second of the 2 objections was that for similar related reasons, statistical information theory has no appropriate application to the process of generation and communication of ideas.
Yeah, I think what he talked about energy. I was wondering about that. Why he objected to the term energy, and he says that it uses a notion reducible to a scalar measure of heat. Now, the point is that you're really dealing with work, not energy. In other words, if you're developing the biosphere, you're adding more, adding more species, a greater mass of living matter. So you're going in a particular direction. You're creating something new. So there's an element of change, and you can't talk about change without a direction. So a scalar has no, it's just a number, but something has a direction would be, I guess you call it a vector, and so that's what he's, I think that's what he's talking about. The other thing, he's saying statistical information theory has no appropriate application to the processes of generation and communication of ideas. Does anybody have anything further on that to say about that?
Well, he's attacking, Russell.
Attacking who?
Russell.
Yeah. I think he's also getting a metaphor. He develops the idea that the communication of ideas involves metaphor, so maybe that's part of it. Okay.
Or statistical information theory is, as in computers, it's entirely deductive. It's axiomatic
Yeah.
and deduction.
Uh-huh.
What does that have to do with the creation of something new?
Yeah, I think
As in
I
ideas.
think so. Yeah,
Or the
we-
communication of it.
I'm fortunate, I haven't read Wiener, but I'm gonna take a look at it. It'd be interesting to just really see what he was attacking.
You can't have a concept of the universe based on just statistics. Concept is a concept of how the universe works. It's not,
Uh-huh.
you know,
Okay. Continue.
On the first of these 2 classes of objections, the kernel of the matter is that for the case of an indefinitely successfully self-developing biosphere, the imputable ratio of free energy to energy of the system increases at the same time that the total energy of the system increases, and that similarly and concurrently, the ratio of free energy to rising energy flux density is also rising. The second of the 2 objections is brought to light more conveniently by examining the analogous case of a successfully evolving physical economy. The obviously intrinsic advantage of this choice of subject matter is that metrical characteristics of the phenomena are predefined in the clearest way. Input-output relations of physical labor and physical consumption defined in per capita and per square kilometer measures. The most readily accessible illustration of this argument is provided broadly by successful models of modern post-14th century economies of the type addressed by Leibniz's 1672 through 1716 work of founding that science of physical economy, also known as the science of technology. Such cases are typified by the characteristic feature of generally increasing intensity of use of heat-powered machinery. The measurement of such model cases in terms of both per capita and per square kilometer caloric values of input and output leads to an array of inequality relationships, by means of which the most relevant relations can be measured comparatively in terms of chronological successions of changes of state of each such economy studied as an integrated whole process. Only the evolutionary model of such a heat-powered process of increase of the productive powers of labor brings the meaningful issues into focus. By contrast, any zero-growth, non-evolutionary model of physical economy is axiomatically entropic and corresponds to no durably successful model of national or global economy. For the evolutionary case, progress in scientific and analogous forms of knowledge is the driver of those changes in practice which lead toward a consequent expression of the indicated lifelike negentropic forms of economic development. It should be stressed that this role of generation and communication of ideas is illustrated by considering Leibniz's study of the proposals for an industrial development based upon the combination of heat-powered machinery and analogous thermodynamical development of modes of production and transport generally. This Leibniz case is a benchmark from which the history of physical economy in general may be traced backward and forward in time. That Leibniz case of increase of the should I let somebody else read?
I just wondered, there was a footnote 5, does that have anything?
Footnote 5.
Oh,
Does that
okay.
have anything?
Yeah, it's just a reference to articles by Leibniz, one of which is on the economy, and it's in Fidelio, so
Oh,
people
okay.
can find that easily.
I don't mind reading still, but if someone else wants to read.
That Leibniz case of increase of the productive powers of
Speak
labor.
louder.
The thing is, it's being recorded by that mic.
That Leibniz case of increase of the productive powers of labor through employment of the heat-powered machine has two readily identified, ironically juxtaposed aspects. First, immediately, there is the simpler aspect, the increase of productive powers of labor, in some functional correlation with increase of heat power supplied efficiently per capita and per square kilometer. In the complementary aspect, on account of nothing other than some improvement in employed principles of design, one machine, using no more power than a comparable second machine, yields greater increase of the productive powers of labor. The second case, the general notion of an efficient improvement in design principle, illustrates for purposes of analysis, the term technology must denote a set of all those machine tool and analogous principles of design, which may be derived commonly from implicitly subsumed by a specific, axiomatically unique quality of scientific or analogous discovery. Reference the refined design of a crucial experiment employed to demonstrate the proof of principle of a crucial scientific hypothesis. Each type of such refined experimental design for that same crucial hypothesis subsumes a set of machine tool principles or a technology. All of the sets subsumed by crucial proof of principle design for that same hypothesis constitute a family of such sets, or a family of technologies derived from that proof of principle. Thus, does scientific discovery lead typically through subsumed technologies toward consequent increases in the productive powers of labor. The relevant task of analysis in physical economy is to show that such generation and transmission of valid creative discoveries as ideas is the source of the realized negentropy of physical economies, and hence of negentropic increases of the potential population density of mankind in our universe. My argument in opposition to statistical information theory was that the generation and transmission of such noetic or negentropic ideas exhibits fundamentally the principle underlying, bounding externally, the transmission of ideas in general.
So what do people make of that last sentence? That's a little bit, that's not obvious what he's saying there. That the generation and transmission of such noetic negentropic ideas exhibits fundamentally the principle underlying, bounding externally, the transmission of ideas in general.
That all ideas are subsumed under this higher principled transmission of the very fundamentals of.
You mean a hypothesis? Yeah.
I'm not putting that word on it, I'm just saying it seems a more of a top-down approach that he's addressing, what he's saying.
It's interesting to me that he unifies this idea, as in the first paragraph, that the process of the process of the generation of a new idea
Yeah.
and the process of a communication of an idea are sort of the same species.
Okay.
And this is as against the transmission of statistical information.
Okay.
That there's some kind of species character of what it is to generate a new idea, which is not dealt with except by his method. And one thing that occurs to me, this is perhaps somewhat associative, that if you think of the Chinese assimilation of the new Silk Road idea, the best of them seem to be continually talking about that this is a new idea. We came on something which is new and revolutionary. And when Helga was in China last summer,
Yeah.
you know, Bao said the LaRouches came here, and this was a new idea. This opened up everything.
Okay.
And then this fellow what's his name? Shi? X-E? Shi?
Sure, spoke there.
Yeah, Professor Shi.
Yeah.
His talk on economics was that economics is the science of innovation. I don't remember it in detail, but definitely the Chinese are working with this idea that
Okay.
what economics is about is somehow harnessing rates of change.
Okay. Well, that might be related to metaphor, because metaphor is fundamentally, when you use a metaphor, it's a new idea. You can't use the regular
Yeah.
channels of communication, usual words. You have to force people to think of something beyond the words they're used to. So it might have something to do with what he might be actually talking about.
I think also he's saying that the ideas are not located in the information. The ideas are, in other words, even to receive an idea, the mind has to replicate the idea. That there's actually mental work done.
Okay.
So it's not a, statistical or informational thing. That there's a noetic process
Okay.
And also,
involved in the whole. Go ahead.
no, finish.
That's all.
Just the sentence before that, is an indication that it's, that this process is reflected in the progress of society as a whole. That it's not separate, it's not just information or something, but that,
Okay.
the individual mind, the generation of that which is assimilated by society, then is defining the progress of society.
Okay.
Analysis to this.
Okay.
Well, what about that last sentence though? Because he's saying the generation of and transmission of noetic negentropic ideas exhibits fundamentally the principle underlying, bounding externally, the transmission of ideas in general. Whereas and this is in opposition to statistical information theory, which, when you're dealing with statistics, you're dealing with something I don't know if this is the point he's making, but when you're dealing with statistics, it's like something that comes from within. You're looking at interactions amongst something within a set, right? It's like, what are the statistical probability of the things
Yeah.
within? And he's saying that in opposition to that, negentropic ideas, it's the principle that externally bounds the transmission of ideas. I'm just not sure. It just sounds like.
Well,
Did you get your answer?
I'm not sure of the answer. I
It
think
seems to me that statistics are a complete abstraction
Mhm.
from anything real.
Yeah.
We're just making it, you know, like taking little slices of something, not even slices. But that didn't cause the process that you're looking at. When you use statistics, you're actually forming an idea of what the process is, and you're using the statistics as an excuse to say this is how you can understand the process, right? It's not really, you know, it's a total abstraction. So what he's saying is different about the idea, which is not abstract.
Statistics as as what? A distraction?
Abstraction.
Abstraction.
'Cause what is it, you know, when you're taking statistics, you're abstracting, you know, some parameters about something that you're looking at or
Yeah.
studying. You're abstracting it.
How does that relate to the sentence?
What about formal logic? Would that be the same thing as statistics?
I think it's the same. Basically, it's all around perception rather than.
Exactly.
I think they both. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think so. Sense certainty.
right.
Yeah.
Second sentence.
How does it relate to that last sentence that Ernie identified?
Well, because
Should we continue?
Because ideas develop
Somebody else can
from
do that.
ideas, they don't, you don't communicate them with statistics, or they don't get generated by statistics.
You run into
Why don't we
it.
see what the paradoxes are that
Yeah.
you just generated, which we're trying to figure out.
Yeah.
This discovery posed two paradoxes. The first of these paradoxes is the formal difficulties posed by stating that the characteristic of all physical economic processes, which meet persistently the standard of increasing population potential density, potential population density, is negentropy. The apparent paradox lies in the fact that I define negentropy as corresponding to an increase of the ratio of free energy to energy and to energy density of the system, under the condition that the energy of the system is continually increasing both per capita and per square kilometer. The second of these two paradoxes is the notion of the functional role of technology's mathematical discontinuities in the theory of heat-powered machinery. Perhaps it may be said that as treasures of pagan mythology are guarded by dragons, forbidding paradoxes often deter the timid from reaching out to the crucial discoveries otherwise within their reach. These apparent paradoxes of my argument prove not the weakness, but rather precisely the strength of my case against positivists such as Wiener, John von Neumann, et al. What's number 6?
No, I'm sorry.
Footnote 6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, it's a reference to John von Neumann's initial proposal to simulate economics and other social phenomena by sets of linear equalities, and then several other books, but no specific comment. So somebody onto the paradoxes, part 2.
I have a question.
I'm sorry.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, if we're saying that
Speak up, please.
Well, if we're saying that the character of the universe is negentropic,
Yeah.
but Einstein, what I read in school, Einstein says energy in a universe is constant. The energy in the universe is constant.
Yeah.
And it may convert into mass and back and forth, but
Yeah.
so how do you?
Well, this is this is actually, I think this goes against the second law of thermodynamics, according to which there's so much that energy, so that chemical reactions, like, they run down and they stop.
Right.
Okay, because they've used up all the free energy available. And so Lin is going against that. He's saying that the second law of thermodynamics is not, see, the whole thing was that Lin has written about over the years is that the second law of thermodynamics describes particular contained, chemical system, or, or heat engine, But for the universe as a whole, or for the biosphere as a whole, who says that's true? I mean, this is just projected. See, that's the whole thing with the fraud of this thing that was developed in the, I guess 1840s. Clausius and Kelvin, these guys came up with that, and they imposed that politically. That's the point. This is a political dogma that's been imposed on.
I get that.
On science.
Yeah, I get that, but what's Einstein talking about when he's saying energy is constant? Is he referring to is that a wrong conclusion by him, or is he talking something else?
I don't think he's wrong, and I think but that would still be in the larger context of what we're talking about here. No, I don't think that. See, again, that's just one process. You're talking about something larger, a larger system, like the biosphere or an economy. Like nuclear energy is just one, which, as you said, changes some mass into energy. This is just one aspect of the entire economy. He's saying an entire economy or a biosphere is actually violates the second law of thermodynamics. I think that's what he's getting at.
Okay.
Well, I also think one thing that you have to keep in mind is that it's one of the reasons Lin doesn't use the word energy, or he says energy, any energy is wrong. What really happens in the universe is a little different, and I think it's a little more difficult for us to figure out, because you don't have creation out of nothing. It's not as though there was nothing there and then there was something there, and that's neg entropy.
Right.
Which I think is a little too close to the way a lot of us think about it most of the time. So you get amongst, Einstein's making the point that there isn't creation ex nihilo. But there is something that goes on, and it may, Einstein did not spend that much time on these kinds of things. There is something going on where not only is there an ability to do more work, but you could say there's a change in the phase space. There's something that's entered in that's redefined the whole system. And that's what Ernie's getting. Once you get to a different system, you're still stuck with the fact that, in a sense, you've gotten a new system. The scalar amount of energy is the same. But your ability to do work somehow is different. And at some point you get an actual discovery, where certainly at one level, our relationship to the universe is that we have available to us a much greater ability to do work, because we open like nuclear or electromagnetic phenomena. Now, therefore, we then do things in the universe that were never done before. But we're doing it with the same amount, but we've redefined the system from the standpoint of what we know and are able to do.
It's just like a very simple example is a dull knife versus a sharp knife. You're just dealing with two physical objects, so you're not changing energy, mass, or anything. But if you say how much energy does it take to cut, 20-foot log, 100 times, and you have a sharp saw and a dull saw, then it seems like it takes less energy, so you're conserving, for the same amount of work. but,
Plus, you can eat more that way.
or food, cut food,
And the simple idea of like
so
the
it's technology.
heat-powered machine, you're having the same amount of energy, electricity or something go through it, but the electricity is ordered according to a new field or a new design or a new
Or a
power.
laser versus a candle.
Yeah, the general, it says, the second case, the general notion of efficient improvement in design principle illustrates the notion of technology. That's at least the first approximation.
When they shifted from steam to electricity, they used to have a big steam boiler running conveyor belts all over a factory. And then when they shifted to electricity, you could just have a little electric motor locally in each machine, and
Yeah.
completely changed the production process.
Lynn, were you gonna read?
Carry on.
Lynn? Subo, you wanna read?
The paradoxes of negentropy. To define my post-1951 attack upon the metrical problem, consider the following. The two paradoxes identified above should be recognized as echoing the issue of Isaac Newton's confession as to the source of his so-called clockwinder paradox. Newton warned thus that the false-to-nature image of an entropic universe had infected his Principia through defects inhering in what he regarded as his only available choice of mathematics.
Sir Isaac Newton states in his famous 4 theological letters to Reverend Dr. Richard Bentley that gravity should be innate, inherent, and essential to matter, so that one body may act upon another at a distance through a vacuum, without the mediation of anything else, by and through which their action and force may be conveyed from one to another, is to me so great an absurdity that I believe no man who has in philosophical matters a competent faculty of thinking can ever fall into it. Gravity must be caused by an agent acting constantly according to certain laws, but whether this agent be material or immaterial, I have left to the consideration of my readers. And it mentions something later we may see in Leibniz-Clark debate, and then he alludes, then he also another reference to by Newton, and another thing that he wrote. So.
But for my adolescent grounding in such relevant works as the Clark-Leibniz correspondence and monadology, I too would probably have been frightened off the track of my discovery by the appearance of the indicated paradoxes. You want to 8 or 9? Really?
Nothing there. Nothing.
The influence of Leibniz upon my view of these two paradoxes is situated historically summarily as follows. In synopsis, the relevant background of Newton's clockwinder problem is this. Although the solar astronomy roots of modern mathematical science reach back far beyond 6000 BC in Vedic Central Asia and in the culture of China, a comprehensive mathematical basis for a unified body of science, quote, natural philosophy, was first founded by Nicholas of Cusa et al. During the early middle decades of Europe's 15th century Golden Renaissance. Of Cusa, Piccolomini, Toscanelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael et al.
I have some things here, footnotes on number 10, which is on the Vedic Central Asia science. He says, astronomical observations recorded in certain amongst the ancient Vedic hymns place their date of composition at an outside limit of approximately 6,000 to 4,000 BC, the Orion. More speculative indications of earlier Arctic astronomical observations in these sources would push back fragments of these hymns to the period no later than the climate shift accompanying the end of the last ice age, Arctic home.
Anything 10, 11, 12?
11. The British holist biologist Joseph Needham, whose encyclopedic writings on the history of science and technology in China dominate 20th century scholarship, went to great lengths to discredit or cover up the discoveries made in the 19th century concerning ancient Chinese astronomy. The French scientist Edouard Biot and the Dutch philologist Gustav Schlegel prove from evidence in the Confucian classics that astronomical science was already highly developed in the 3rd millennium BC. And Schlegel's research led him to hypothesize that significant mapping of the heavens existed at the extremely early date of the 16th millennium BC. Needham, while acknowledging the authority and competence of these scientists, labeled their findings as quite absurd and purely legendary, lying they had little support and that they served to discredit what real historical research might reveal. This because, in keeping with British historiography, he insisted such knowledge had necessarily to be, quote, derived from Babylonian sources.
So he calls him, calls Needham the asshole scientist? Is that what he said? You said something about holeless, asshole.
Yeah.
No, Needham trained Martin Palmer, who was Prince Philip's leading Chinese and environmental expert. People should look at the article from 2 weeks ago by Billington on this.
Okay.
Where Billington, a whole study of Needham back
He said
in
Needham said
Fidelio.
that not the Confucians, but the Taoists were the true scientists.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple more here. Number 12, which came after reference to the great thinkers of the Renaissance, including Cusa. He says, the Golden Renaissance of the 15th century is centered around the 1439 to 1440 Council of Florence as the principal event. Nicholas of Cusa is the principal figure of that period, whose work on science directly shaped the work of such figures as Leonardo da Vinci and Luca Pacioli, indirectly thus the entire school of Raphael, and also the work of Kepler. And then you have a footnote for Pomponazzi and the Neo-Aristotelians. He says, Pietro Pomponazzi, philosopher who enjoyed the patronage of the Contarini family, he studied and taught at the University of Padua. He took Averroes as his point of departure, and by dichotomizing discourse into the philosophical and the religious, argued that according to reason, the soul must die with the body, but according to the teaching of Christianity, we know it to be immortal. This argument appears in his major work, on the immortality of the soul. And then on 14, Zorzi is the fellow who was associated with Henry VIII, I think. Yeah. He's a Franciscan friar descended from the patrician Zorzi family of Venice, author of De Harmonia Mundi, a mystical work with elements derived from the Kabbalah. Zorzi supported the arguments of King Henry VIII when he sought the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and was called to the English royal court, where he remained active. Between 1531 and his death in 1540, he was a proponent of a satanic and pseudo-Platonic school of mysticism called Rosicrucianism, which became an important component of English and British Freemasonry.
The complication leading to Newton's clockwinder problem was the spread of a Venice-directed opposition to the Council of Florence, an attack which featured the neo-Aristotelian empiricism of such Gasparo Contarini associates as Pomponazzi and the Franciscan Kabbalist Francesco Zorzi. Through this continuing influence upon England of such Venetian potencies as the notorious Paolo Sarpi, we have Baconian empiricism and British philosophical liberalism generally.
Okay, I'd like to start as he said that if he hadn't read, he's saying he hadn't read Leibniz, he might not have been able to, when he was, a teenager, he would not have been able, he's saying I might not have been able to take this thing on. So I think it'd be very important to get a sense of why he says that. What is there in Leibniz that's so totally extraordinary from his standpoint. So and we won't need that. But this is going to be, you're going to see the first letter of the Leibniz Clark, and he goes right on, right on the attack, against what you'll see. It's directly on this clockwinder problem. So if you can boost it up. Keep going. Okay, that's good. All right. let me get my own copy out, Alicia.
Are you just wanting to read it?
No, I'm not gonna read it. Somebody should read it, but I want my book so I can, Alicia.
I can read it for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Natural religion itself seems to decay in England very much. Many will have a human, what's that word?
Access?
Being.
A human being.
To
Okay.
be material. Others make God himself a corporeal being. Mr. Locke and his followers are uncertain at least whether the soul be not material and naturally perishable. Sir Isaac Newton says that space is an organ which God makes use of to perceive things by. But if God stands in need of an organ to perceive things by, it will follow.
That they,
It will follow what?
that they,
That they do not depend altogether on him, nor were produced by him. Sir Isaac Newton and his followers have also a very odd opinion concerning the what of God. The what of God? What is that word?
Ernie, do you have it there?
Yeah, yeah.
Number
yeah.
4.
I'm sorry.
Number 4?
Yeah, it says Sir Isaac Newton and his followers have also a very odd opinion concerning the work of God.
According to their doctrine, God Almighty wants, i.e. needs, to wind up his watch from time to time. Otherwise it would cease to move. He had not, it seems, sufficient foresight to make a perpetual motion. Nay, the machine of God's making is so imperfect,
Move it up,
according to these gentlemen, that he is
Move it up.
obliged
I
to
will.
clean
I'll
it now,
relax.
and then, by an extraordinary concourse, and even to mend it, as a clockmaker mends his work, who must consequently be so much the more unskillful a workman, as he is something obliged to mend his work and to set it right. According to my opinion, maybe Ernie better read the rest, because it's,
no, the rest of it's better. Expand.
someone else better read, I've lost place.
Well, it was in the middle of a
Right off
sentence
of the
Yeah,
page.
on
it's
the
at
prior
the top.
page.
Scroll up.
Top of the page.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Well, I don't remember what came before, does anybody else? We've
According
lost-
to my opinion, the same force and vigor remains always in the world and only passes from one part of matter to another, agreeably to the laws of nature and the beautiful pre-established order. And I hold that when God works miracles, he does not do it in order to supply the wants of nature, but those of grace. Whoever thinks otherwise must needs have a very mean notion of the wisdom and power of God.
Now, there's a reference here that I think is important. Where did Leibniz get this idea that Newton is saying these things? Okay, here's the footnote. Well, anyway, this is what the Blomker, the editor, attributes it to. Maybe that's not correct, but Clarke supplies the reference to Newton's optics. Question 31. Irregularities in cometal motion led Newton to ascribe laws of energy to collision and to suggest the possibility of a time when the present system of nature shall want to be anew put in order by its author. So that's, he sort of seems to be admitting it, but you know what what Leibniz is saying anyway. Okay, so Clarke's first reply, somebody want to read that unless it's on a question?
That there are some in England as well as in other countries who deny or very much corrupt even natural religion itself is very true and much to be lamented. But next to the vicious affections of men, this is to be principally ascribed to the false philosophy of the materialists, to which the mathematical principles of philosophy are the most directly repugnant. That some make the souls of men, and others even God himself, to be a corporeal being is also very true. But those who do so are the great enemies of the mathematical principles of philosophy, which principles, and which alone, prove matter or body to be the smallest and most inconsiderable part of the universe. That Mr. Locke doubted whether the soul was immaterial or no, may justly be suspected from some parts of his writings. But herein he has been followed only by some materialists, enemies to the mathematical principles of philosophy, and who approve little or nothing in Mr. Locke's writings but his errors.
Why don't we, unless we want to comment on that, I would suggest we follow the sequence in the argument about the machine, winding up the world, and go down to the last paragraph of that page. The Renaissance says the reason why among men.
There it is.
The reason why among men an artificer is justly esteemed so much the more skillful, as the machine of his composing will continue longer to move regularly without any further interposition of the workman, is because the skill of all human artificers consists only in composing, adjusting, or putting together certain movements, the principles of whose motion are altogether independent upon the artificer. Such are weights and springs and the like, whose forces are not made, but only adjusted by the workman. But with regard to God, the case is quite different, because he not only composes or puts things together, but is himself the author and continual preserver of their original forces or moving powers. And consequently, 'tis not a diminution, but the true not a diminution, but the true glory of his workmanship, that nothing is done without his continual government and inspection. The notion of the world's being a great machine, going on without the interposition of God as a clock continues to go without the assistance of a clockmaker, is the notion of materialism and fate, and tends, under pretense of making God a supramundane intelligence, to exclude providence and God's government in reality out of the world. Is that footnote 4 relevant?
Yeah, I'll get it. Oh, yeah, okay. It says Clark's note refers to Theodicy, page 396, where Leibniz says, God, according to my opinion, is an extra-mundane intelligence, as Martianus Capella styles him, or rather, a super-mundane intelligence. So he's attacking Theodicy.
And by the same reason that a philosopher can represent all things going on from the beginning of the creation without any government or interposition of providence, a skeptic will easily argue still further backward and suppose that things have from eternity gone on as they now do, without any true creation or original author at all, but only what such arguers call all-wise and eternal nature. If a king had a kingdom wherein all things would continually go on without his government or interposition, or without his attending to and ordering what is done therein, it would be to him merely a nominal kingdom, nor would he in reality deserve at all the title of king or governor. And as those men who pretend that in an earthly government things may go on perfectly well without the king himself ordering or disposing of anything, may reasonably be suspected that they would like very much to set the king aside. So whosoever contends that the course of the world can go on without the continual direction of God, the supreme governor, his doctrine does in effect tend to exclude God out of the world. More a justification for monarchy than a
Yeah.
philosophy about
Yeah.
God and
Wow.
nature.
Uh-huh.
We need those worthless aristocrats.
I guess we can, there's two themes here in the second letter here by Leibniz. One is he's gonna take this, he's gonna answer this thing. The other thing is, takes up this question, you'll see, of mathematics versus physics, okay, which keeps coming up, you'll see with Lynn's and with Riemann. So anyway, the two things. So, I think we're a little short of time, so why don't we right now take the one up on where Leibniz replies to this last argument, okay, that's number 6 on page 678, I wanna see that back and forth on that.
The next page?
Maybe, I don't know, you'll have to look at it. 6, can you see the page number?
That's 678 on the left, number 6.
6, 7, 8?
It's the left-hand side.
Okay,
Yeah,
down near
okay.
the bottom.
Yeah, it's the last paragraph, number 6, item number 6.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to. You got it.
There.
You got it right.
The true and principal reason why we commend a machine is rather grounded upon the effects of the machine than upon its cause. We don't inquire so much about the power of the artist as we do about his skill in his workmanship. And therefore the reason alleged by the author for extolling the machine of God's making, grounded upon his having made it entirely, without wanting any materials to make it of, that reason, I say, is not sufficient. 'Tis a mere shift the author has been forced to have recourse to. And the reason why God exceeds any other artist is not only because he makes the whole, whereas other artists, 'tis a mere shift the author has been forced to have recourse to. And the reason why God exceeds any other artist is not only because he makes the whole, whereas other artists must have matter to work upon. This excellency in God would be only on the account of power. But God's excellency arises also from another cause, namely wisdom, whereby his machine lasts longer and moves more regularly than those of any other artist whatsoever. He who buys a watch does not mind whether the workman made every part of it himself, or whether he got the several parts made by. No, it's the right column.
Next page, yeah.
Oh.
Next page.
Yeah, that's it.
Or whether he got the
Oops, I'm sorry.
several parts made by others and did only put them together, provided the watch goes right. And if the workman had received from God even the gift of creating the matter of the wheels, yet the buyer of the watch would not be satisfied unless the workman had also received the gift of putting them well together. In like manner, he who will be pleased with God's workmanship cannot be so without some other reason than that which the author has here alleged.
Yeah, let's continue with this. It's the same thing. He's
Number
continuing
7.
to Crush this guy.
Thus, the skill of God must not be inferior to that of a workman. Nay, it must go infinitely beyond it. The bare production of everything would indeed show the power of God, but it would not sufficiently show his wisdom. They who maintain the contrary will fall exactly into the error of the materialists and of Spinoza, from whom they profess to differ. They would, in such case, acknowledge power, but not sufficient wisdom in the principle or cause of all things. I do not say the material world is a machine or watch that goes without God's interposition, and I have sufficiently insisted that the creation wants to be continually influenced by its creator. But I maintain it to be a watch that goes without wanting to be mended by him. Otherwise, we must say that God bethinks himself again. No, God has foreseen everything. He has provided a remedy for everything beforehand. There is in his works a harmony, a beauty already pre-established. Keep going.
Yeah, a little more. He's still on this theme.
This opinion does not exclude God's providence or his government of the world. On the contrary, it makes it perfect. A true providence of God requires a perfect foresight. But then it requires, moreover, not only that he should have foreseen everything, but also that he should have provided for everything beforehand with proper remedies. Otherwise, he must want either wisdom to foresee things or power to provide against them. He will be like the god of the Socinians, who lives from day to day, as Mr. Giroux says. Indeed, God, according to the Socinians, does not so much as foresee inconveniences, whereas the gentleman I am arguing with, who put him upon mending his work, say only that he does not provide against them. But this seems to me to be still a very great imperfection. According to this doctrine, God must want either power or goodwill. Und?
There's a little more if you want to continue.
I don't think I can be rightly blamed for saying that God is intelligentia supramundana. Will they say he is intelligentia mundana? That is the soul of the world? I hope not. However, they will do well to take care not to fall into that notion unawares. The comparison of a king under whose reign everything should go on without his interposition is by no means to the present purpose, since God preserves everything continually and nothing can subsist without him. His kingdom, therefore, is not a nominal one. 'Tis just as if one should say that a king who should originally have taken care to have his subjects so well educated, and should, by his care in providing for their substance, preserve them so well in their fitness for their several stations and in their good affection toward him, as that he should have no occasion ever to be amending anything among them, would be only a nominal king. To conclude, if God is obliged to mend the course of nature from time to time, it must be done either supernaturally or naturally. If it be done supernaturally, we must have recourse to miracles in order to explain natural things, which is reducing a hypothesis ad absurdum, for everything may easily be accounted for by miracles. But if it be done naturally, then God will not be intelligentia supramundana. He will be comprehended under the nature of things. That is, he will be the soul of the world.
So if you were Leibniz and you read this, would you be how would you? I mean, if you were Lynn and LaRouche and you read this, how would you respond? How would this affect you?
Be very excited about it,
This is what he said. This was what made it one of the principal things made it possible for him to take on this. It's not only Wiener. He also did a whole thing and was a teenager against Kant. He said that exercise more than anything made it possible, really, for him to then take on Wiener. But it was based on his defense of Kant did a whole thing. We're going to get to it. I think it's I guess next time. I was thinking next time there's this thing that Kant wrote when he was about 20 years old. It's about trying to prove that there is absolute space, which is something that comes out also in the Leibniz-Clark thing, that Newton believes in absolute space. And there's some other thing that Leibniz is attacking. But Kant is trying to prove that. In order to do that, he has to refute something that Leibniz wrote, and it's called analysis cetus. Okay? And it's a very interesting, the whole way it all interlocks, because he attacks analysis cetus, and then Gauss, in his paper on the metaphysics of complex numbers, he has a footnote, because he's talking about distinguishing your left from right. Okay? And so Gauss goes through this idea that once you relate the left and right to yourself, your own body, and then he points out, he says how Kant didn't seem to understand this. He refers him to the quick-witted philosopher who failed to see this. And then fourth, Riemann, you'll see in his dissertation, he says there are a few documents that I'm referring to in developing all these ideas. And he says one of them is an article by Gauss, and that's particularly the thing where he takes on Kant. So anyway, so I think it's all very relevant to, we'll get to that next time.
Phil, can I ask a quick question? On Einstein, when saying that he is the only scientist of any worth during the 20th century, I was wondering about Vernadsky, why Vernadsky is not.
I don't know. Lynn has, sometimes he said Einstein was the only scientist in the United States. He was the only scientist in the West. I don't, first of all, know if Lynn means it globally. But the second point is, I think a great deal of it is tied up with the fact that Einstein did wage a certain kind of principled fight with the whole introduction of, mathematical hegemony, with the Solvay Conference of 27 and 30. And he continued that fight until the day he died. And that, in some ways, that fight is still going on. I mean, the main way people go epistemologically at the quantum theorists, well, not so much but the quantum theory, the theoretical background, is by reference to Einstein. So I think minimally he's talking about that Einstein was committed to the idea that science is the effort to discover the underlying principles or the real principles that govern the universe. As he famously said, I want to read the mind of God. I think that's what he's referring to. Whether or not that references Vernadsky in the same way, I don't know. He may be referring to Western science, and therefore Vernadsky doesn't really, it's not that important in that discussion. Well, that's possible. Otherwise, I think it could be the polemical side. It's not 100% clear to me that also Vernadsky had a somewhat incomplete idea of this whole question of space-time, even though he did think that the difference was space-time. He didn't necessarily, as far as I can see, have the clearest idea of what Einstein meant by relativity, really. Some people think that Einstein did fall short. I'm a little inclined to think he might have, but Vernadsky also, I'm not sure he really got the philosophical underpinnings of what Einstein was up to. But I don't think it really, I think a lot of it is just that he's really referring to the debate that occurred in Western science.
Yeah, the Solvay Conference.